Good morning, comrades. It's really nice to see some familiar faces, but also many people who I've never met before. And so I'm really looking forward to listening to, working with and hearing what you have to say, because we really want today to be as interactive and dynamic a day and dynamic sessions as we possibly can. Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains is probably the most famous rallying cry from the most famous written work of Karl Marx and his lifelong collaborator and friend Friedrich Engels, the Communist Manifesto. As it happens, there is some doubt as to whether those were in fact the precise words that they used in the manifesto. But what's not in doubt is that that is the sentiment that they were seeking to convey. And I think that that short sentence and the publication that it came from, it speaks volumes. It demonstrates, I think, three key facts. Firstly, that they were internationalists. It's a rallying call directed across national boundaries. That they were men of action. It's a pamphlet, it's a manifesto, a declaration of aims. And finally, it's directed at workers. They saw the key change as being the working class. Now, two questions flow from that. Firstly, were they right? And secondly, if they were right, what guidance do those words and those demands give us for the struggles that we face today? Of course, the overwhelming consensus amongst historians, political commentators, political activists is that they weren't right. It's widely argued that Marxism is an old-fashioned grand narrative, an overarching analysis of the world, its social, economic and political development, which is flawed and outdated. We're told it's a dead philosophy written by old white men that's Eurocentric and fails to take account of the complexities of the world as it has developed and how it is today. More particularly, it's argued by people who want to change the world, who hate the world that we live in, that Marxism's supposed obsession with class and with class struggle means that it fails to understand the uniqueness and the specificity of particular forms of oppression. What's argued is that what that means in practical terms is that if we have anything to say about oppression at all, it is, to put it admittedly slightly crudely, wait for the revolution. Once we've succeeded in overthrowing the ruling class, then we can turn our attention to racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever forms of oppression there are. Or perhaps we won't even need to bother, because somehow magically, once this glorious socialist utopia has been created, these forms of oppression will simply melt away. What do we actually say? I don't imagine that anyone in this room either joined or certainly wouldn't remain a member of the Socialist Workers' Party if you thought that our attitude was that we should simply wait for the revolution to happen. We recognise that oppression is real. We recognise the discrimination against individuals or groups on the basis of some actual or perceived difference is real. Black, Asian and minority ethnic people are marginalised and denied our fair share of society's wealth, its resources, because of our colour, our culture, our ethnic origin, and increasingly today, as I'm sure Esme will show in the session that she leads on Islamophobia and secularism, on the basis of people's religion. We recognise that that discrimination manifests itself in a number of ways, whether it's perhaps most horrifically in the form of racist violence, the murder of Stephen Lawrence back in 1993, the murder 20 years after Stephen's death of Mohammed Salim, the father of Maz Salim, the brilliant activist that I'm sure many of you know and are familiar with. Or more recently, in the area of London that I live in, South London, the violent attack that left 17-year-old Iranian Kurd Reka Arma beaten to within an inch of his life, simply for being and admitting to being an asylum seeker. Racist violence or indeed the institutional racism that the Lawrence family campaign exposed following Stephen's death, the systematic discrimination in terms of housing, education, employment, treatment at the hands of the criminal justice system, and so on. And so consequently, far from simply waiting for this glorious day to arrive, we recognise the need to fight these evils in the here and now, whether it's organising united fronts against fascists, whether it's building support for the Stephen Lawrence family campaign, or, Saba indicated, providing solidarity for refugees, defending the rights of EU migrants to remain in the UK, as Stand Up to Racism has done so brilliantly over the course of the last couple of years. We do all of those things, and we have a record about which we can be proud, and which I'm sure Wayman and Alex will highlight, particularly in the final session. So when we wrote our book about Marxism and the fight against racism, it was not for nothing that we called it Say It Loud. But we don't simply rest on our laurels or our previous record. The whole purpose of this day school is to discuss and clarify our ideas and to draw the practical conclusions that flow from them in order to deepen and strengthen our work. The purpose of Marxism is to fuse theory and practice. Marx and Engels tried to build an international movement. Marx himself famously said of some of his critics that philosophers have interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. And therefore, what I'm going to aim to do in this session is to offer a bit of an overview of some of the key issues that will be addressed in more depth throughout the rest of the day. It's certainly true that our analysis does begin with an emphasis upon class, because we believe that if you want to understand and effectively challenge oppression, you have to begin by looking at society in its totality. And to begin with, therefore, simply, if you think about it, just in order to survive and continue, there are some basic things that we need to do. We need to eat, we need clothing, we need shelter, we have to reproduce for the human race to continue, and so on. Straightforward, self-evident facts. And for most of human history, 90% of it, we did that without hierarchies and without forms of oppression. And indeed, it was by looking back at those so-called primitive communist societies that Marx developed his ideas about how it's possible to live cooperatively in the future. Of course, the difficulty that those societies faced was that they were very basic societies living on the edge of subsistence and so on. But our ability to collaborate, to think, and to innovate led to the gradual development of surpluses, and from that more settled communities. And once that happened, the question emerged about who controlled that surplus. And it was the gradual struggle for control of that surplus that led to the development of class societies. A minority were able to seize control of the surplus and gradually develop a whole structure, armies, hierarchies of power, laws, political parties, courts, and so on, that reinforced and enshrined their domination and forced others, the majority, to labour for them. Okay, that may explain briefly, and I'll admit slightly inadequately, how class societies and class divisions develop, but where do ideas come from? Marx argued that those who control the means of production also control the mental means of production, the schools, the churches, the press, the media, and so on. And through that, they're able to ensure that the dominant ideas in society are their ideas, the ideas of the ruling class. And they need to justify their elevated position, and they do so, therefore, by relentlessly promoting ideas that teach the rest of us to know our place. Anthony's session on the roots of racism will demonstrate how racism emerged at a very specific point in the development of class society, namely with the advent of capitalism, and it developed systematically as an ideology precisely in order to justify the most brutal treatment that was meted out to those who were transported, flogged, often literally to death, in order to provide the profit that fueled the early development of capitalism. And I think what that demonstrates, therefore, is that contrary to the widely accepted view that racism starts and is primarily located typically with ignorant, violent thugs on marginalised estates, it starts at the top of society and seeps downwards. And though, if you think about it, the horrific murders, the violent attacks perpetrated by thugs and so on is horrific, and much though, of course, we have to continue to organise and campaign against organised racists and fascists and so on, it is in fact that institutional racism, the systematic discrimination in terms of jobs, homes, employment and so on, that's the most common experience that those of us from black, Asian and minority ethnic communities experience. Now, if that assertion is true, that racism has specific historical roots and was developed in order to serve the interests of the ruling class, it follows that you have to reject the idea that somehow it's something that is wired into the DNA of white people. Having that overall Marxist understanding of society in its totality, I think also helps to explain the changing nature of racism. I've argued that the origins of racism lie in slavery, but clearly slavery no longer exists, certainly not to the same extent today. Unquestionably, racism most certainly exists. Why? Because the fundamental role that oppression plays is in dividing the mass of people who own and control little or nothing, and thereby entrenching and reinforcing the power and authority of the ruling class. And actually, it's a point that Marx expressed particularly well when he considered the antagonism that existed between English and Irish workers. It's worth quoting at some length what he had to say, because I think it shows, amongst other things, just how seriously he took this particular question. He said this, and I quote, "Every industrial and commercial centre in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a member of the ruling nation, and consequently, he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. He cherishes religious, social and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him is much the same as that of the poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the United States of America. The Irishman pays him back with interest in his own money. He sees in the English worker both the accomplice and the stupid tool of the English rulers in Ireland. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling class. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organisation. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this." Those words were written in 1870, almost 150 years ago. Now, consider the most common arguments that we hear today, that Muslims are a threat to our society and therefore we have to discipline and discriminate against them in order to protect ourselves, that economic migrants and refugees are a threat to our way of life and standard of living. That's almost exactly what our previous Prime Minister David Cameron said when he described people living in those squalid camps in France as being a swarm. And his then Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, now the Chancellor of the Exchequer, very specifically said that economic migrants and refugees are a threat to the standard of living of Europe. And they argue, don't they, that these people come over here and they take our jobs, they claim benefits which they're not entitled to because they haven't paid into the system, that they take school places from British-born children, that, you know, one of the most horrific recent terms that you hear, that they're health tourists who come over here in order to take advantage of our free National Health Service. They're lies, of course. But it's clear that these lies have some purchase amongst working class people. And I should say, not just white working class people, but also often amongst those generations of people who themselves came over to live and work in Britain in the aftermath of the Second World War and so on. And indeed, if you look at quite comprehensive surveys like the British Social Attitude Surveys, which track attitude, not just static polls, but have tracked people's attitude to issues of immigration over a period of time, they suggest that anti-immigrant sentiment has been growing for quite some period of time. Now, Saba referred to the catastrophe of UKIP's press conference yesterday, and it was absolutely brilliant to see them harassed and harangued. But we shouldn't forget just how much electoral success they've enjoyed in recent years. Remember, in 2014, they came top of the poll in the European Union elections. They won 27% and 24 seats. The general election in 2015, they only won 1 seat, but that's simply because of the peculiarity of the electoral system that we have. Had we had a system of proportional representation, the 3.9 million votes that they won would have translated into 83 seats in Parliament. And quite good analysts have suggested that that's because they quite cynically and specifically tapped into anti-immigrant sentiment. Now, again, far from being irrelevant, I think that Marxism helps to explain why you see these spikes in racism. I mean, as it happens, capitalism's need for labour has meant for decades the bosses have wanted to encourage immigration, and therefore they've been prepared to use the language of multiculturalism, integration and so on in order to serve their needs, whilst at the same time using racism to undermine the possible unity that might create amongst workers of different ethnic, cultural, religious backgrounds and so on. If you think at the whole industrial strategy that was followed by the new Labour government under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, they wanted to solve Britain's supposed demographic time bomb, the fact that there weren't enough young people in the workforce or coming through, and too many people having the temerity to live longer and to claim the pensions that they'd worked for. They wanted to solve this demographic time bomb by bringing in workers from Eastern Europe. That was the strategy that they pursued in the early 2000s. The same Gordon Brown, who for electoral advantage in 2009 was talking about British jobs for British workers. Complete hypocrisy. And I think increasingly, of course, we're living in a period of deep and seemingly intractable economic crisis exemplified by the crash of 2008. And in those circumstances, it's more important than ever for the bosses, the bankers, the owners of big business and so on to deflect the blame for that catastrophe away from themselves. Hence, they scapegoat the very people whose presence in the labour market they rely upon and have encouraged. It's a dangerous game they're playing and so on. But we should recognise this is not a rational system. It's a crazy, illogical system. They are a band of warring brothers. What unites them, however, is their contempt for working class people and their need to exploit working class people. So again, there's a material explanation. The racist ideas don't simply exist in the heads of people or emerge out of thin air, and they're not accepted simply because people are inherently ignorant, racist, selfish or whatever. The acceptance of racist ideas is rooted in the real and increasing misery that people experience in their lives. And that's why we argue that whilst those ideas are mistaken, and whilst it's important to challenge them, it's wrong to simply berate people and dismiss them as being irretrievably backward, bigoted, and so on. It's also, of course, the reason why we reject the idea that somehow white working class people benefit from racism. Now, of course, it's true that on the whole, white workers have better jobs, are more likely to get promotion, less likely to live in squalid housing, less likely to be criminalised and so on. That is precisely how institutional racism works. As Marx's analysis of the so-called Irish question indicates, it's a measure of how the system cynically pits us against each other and forces us to compete. But it does so in order to exploit all of us, leaving all of us worse off than we would have been than if we unite and struggle together. And that's why I'm sure in the session that Kate will lead off in more depth, will explain why we reject the ideas of white supremacy and the notion that somehow racism affords white workers some kind of privilege. So there's a material explanation for racist ideas and why they're held by workers of all different backgrounds. How do people's ideas change? Well, we argue that the ideas of the ruling class, Marx said, the dominant ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, but they're not the only ideas that people have. Ordinary people aren't simply empty vessels into which these ideas are poured and are retained. Instead, we're real, living, thinking people capable of our own thoughts. And people learn from their own experience as well. Experiences which are mixed and contradictory, precisely because of the type of society that we live in. I've drawn attention to the fact that capitalism forces us to compete with each other. And of course it's true that there is real segregation in the areas that people live in, who they associate with and so on. Not necessarily as much as you might have thought, and I think that's an issue that we might want to discuss in the workshops and so on. But as well as forcing us to compete, capitalism forces us to cooperate with each other. It forces us to come together. If you think about it, young people go to school together, they play together, learn together, go to college and university together. And of course, increasingly these days, but certainly here in Britain, people form relationships, fall in love with each other, have families, and so on. We work together in our factories, call centres, schools, transport hubs, council offices, and so on. Of course, and what is the largest employer in Britain? The National Health Service. A National Health Service that would not function without doctors, nurses, ancillary staff, and so on from all over the world. Something which has always been the case, from the very beginning, when the then health minister, a man called Enoch Powell, in the early 1950s, travelled to the Caribbean to encourage Caribbean workers to come over and offer your skills to the emerging National Health Service. The same Enoch Powell, who in 1968 and again in the 1970s was talking of rivers of blood if we allow, grinning pickaninnies if you know, and the horrors that would create if we allow too many black and Asian people to come into the country. And so it's in that context of people living, working together and so on that people's ideas can change. We realise that you know, those experiences, the cooperation, the camaraderie of people coming together, contradicts the rotten, divisive ideas of the ruling class. And to some extent, it explains why they have to work so hard, day after day after day, propagating their rotten ideas through the gutter press and so on. But if you look at, you know, the outpouring of support and solidarity for refugees, people marching against government policy, collecting, you know, goods and so on, taking delegations over to the camps and so on, volunteering to work in the camps and so on, completely contradicting the ideas of the male, the son and so on. More generally, working class people's ideas change and are more likely to be shaken off. That, you know, what the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci described as the contradictory consciousness of workers is shaken off and challenged when people struggle together and in the course of that struggle realise who their comrades are, who their friends are and who their enemies are in those struggle. And those, I'll begin to wind up, those are the reasons why we place such an emphasis upon working class struggle and working class organisation. We don't do so out of some, you know, fetishistic love for workers, that they're wonderful people. We do it because we recognise that working class people have the capacity to change and the collective power to put an end to a system of exploitation that relies upon oppression and the collective ability to replace it with something much better. None of that is given. None of that is automatic. The acts of solidarity that we have witnessed haven't just been down to the altruistic behaviour of individuals. Often it's fuelled by the active intervention of campaigners and political activists, alongside the likes of Care for Calais. Brilliant individuals like Claire Mosley, who runs that organisation. Stand Up to Racism has been actively involved in the refugee solidarity work by encouraging people, you know, encouraging the political activity that brings that kind of work together. And that really brings me onto my final point. Our main session on looking at the Communist Party in the 1930s through to the Black Panthers will show that far from simply waiting for the revolution, socialists have always thrown themselves into the anti-racist struggle, and in so doing have helped to make a difference. We celebrate those struggles as part of a tradition that we are proud to be associated with, but we don't do so uncritically. The Panthers were giants upon whose shoulders we should be proud to struggle, but as I'm sure Armin will demonstrate, or I hope he demonstrates, there were weaknesses in their strategy and approach which prevented them from fulfilling their full potential. They had a spectacular rise, but an equally spectacular and swift demise. We want to stand on their shoulders in order to see further and more clearly, as clearly there is still a world to win. And that's why, as well as fighting racism in the here and now for its own sake, we're trying to build a party that can fight for the revolutionary transformation that will put an end to the system that creates it in the first place. And how we do that really should be the theme of all of our discussions and the final message that Wayman and Alex will deliver in the final session this afternoon. Thanks, comrades.